not on a few people at a booth at the World's Fair, but on hundreds of thousands of Americans, making him a millionaire in the early years of the 1900s, which is about the equivalent of $15 or $20 million today. Now, I tell you the story of Claude Hopkins to impress on all of us that if we dare to be a Daniel in terms of character, in terms of integrity, in terms of honesty, then we will most likely have to resist the lure of easy money, of the path of least resistance at some point in our lives. Dare to be a Daniel. Well, Daniel's enemies figured out that they could not bring Daniel down by attacking his competence or attacking his character, and so they had to attack his religion. It seems that he did not hide his thrice daily times of prayer, and so they designed a law that had no other point but to bring pressure to bear on Daniel with regard to that practice. His custom of daily prayer. He either had to compromise his religion, or he had to leave his government post, or he had to pay the ultimate price. Now, that was not the last time in history that measures like that have been conceived and given the force of law. How many of you know what Sharia law is? Sharia law holds sway in most Muslim majority countries, and it puts a great deal of pressure on Christians to convert to Islam or to suffer the consequences. And if there's persecution in this country today, it often takes this form. Laws, or more often regulations that are put into force by bureaucrats that basically say, you either leave your Christianity at the door or sacrifice your business. So this law, this form of persecution designed by these governors and satraps, provides the backdrop that highlights the next facet of Daniel's excellence, and that's his consistency. His consistency. His consistency is described in verse 10. It says that in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. It's probable that Daniel learned this pattern from David, who said in Psalm 55, evening and morning and at noon I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. Notice that verse 10 indicates that this thrice daily prayer had been Daniel's custom since his youth, since early days. If you want an explanation of how and why the Holy Spirit worked so powerfully in Daniel's life, look no further than this statement in verse 10. Here's the explanation for his excellence, for his competence, for his character. Now, many of us make excuses because we find it too difficult to be consistent in prayer even once a day. We think we're too busy. We seem to think that spending time in prayer even once a day, let alone 3 times a day, will hinder our success. I'm too busy for that. We might not say that out loud, but that's what we think, that's how we act. But here was a man who was set to become the prime minister of what was probably the largest nation on earth at that point. And he still found time to consistently pray, not once a day, but 3 times a day. Most of us have it exactly backwards. Consistently taking the time to pray does not hinder us. It is rather the secret to success, to excellence, to being the est, to being super, to being superlative. One of the habits that's helped me most in my professional life is praying in the morning with my schedule in front of me and praying through the day. Thinking about the major tasks and the appointments and the meetings that I'm going to have that day, the responsibilities that I'm going to have, and praying about each one. Now, I'm a project manager, and very often as I pray in that way, the Lord, the Holy Spirit kind of taps me on the shoulder and says, you know, you forgot something. You forgot about this. What about that? Or it seems the Holy Spirit comes and takes me by the hand and says, you know, in order to get this done, here's an approach you ought to think about. There is nothing more practical than prayer if we wish to be competent in our professions. I also believe that it was these times of prayer each day that enabled Daniel to resist the temptations, the pressures of that foreign culture. He had done it for nearly 70 years. I mean, do you remember what happened to Daniel when he was still a teenager? The story is back in Daniel chapter 1. He was given a portion of the king's meat. I mean, that sounds great. I like meat. But it was meat that had been offered to idols, and Daniel could not eat that meat without violating the law of God. Now, where did Daniel, as a teenager, find the strength to stand up under the pressure of the entire Babylonian culture? He found it in prayer. Now, what's the secret to this kind of consistency in prayer? Most of us as Christians have a real problem with consistency in daily prayer. What's the secret? I don't know. If there is a secret, it's simply called self-discipline. Good old-fashioned self-discipline. Well, let me share 2 facts about self-discipline, because I think self-discipline, I think many of us have a misconception about it. First of all, I think many of us view self-discipline as something that you get in the Marine Corps. Unless you had a mother who was a drill sergeant, then you didn't need to go to the Marine Corps. I mean, I've heard statements like those in Christian circles for many, many years, that that's what we need. I mean, we essentially need drill sergeants. Let me share a secret with you. Self-discipline, the New Testament word is self-control, is a fruit of the Spirit. It's not a fruit of the Marine Corps. Isn't that interesting? So where should self-discipline flow from? Self-discipline should flow from dependence on the Holy Spirit in our lives. And that brings me to the second observation. Self-discipline and prayer ought to create a self-reinforcing cycle in our lives. So if I depend on God, if I depend on the Holy Spirit for the self-control, for the self-discipline to schedule time to pray and then to follow through and actually pray, then I need to make certain that part of that prayer is depending on the Holy Spirit for the next time I need to pray. And see, that's not what we do, is it? I get, this high and mighty resolution, I'm going to begin in prayer, and I do it right. I depend on the Holy Spirit, and I schedule that daily time of prayer, and the first couple of times I depend on the Holy Spirit and I pray, but somehow it immediately breaks down, and I cease to depend on the Holy Spirit. And the whole thing breaks down. This is a cycle of dependence, of faith. Well, there's a final facet of Daniel's excellence, one last area where he was super, where he was est, and that's Daniel's courage. Daniel's courage. When we sing "Dare to be a Daniel," it's this character trait that we're normally thinking about. Notice, again, that first phrase in verse 10. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home and prayed 3 times that day. Daniel wasn't dumb. He knew the score. He knew that his enemies had been investigating him. He knew the reason behind the new law, but he refused to compromise. Or let me put it this way, courage is often a refusal to rationalize. Courage is often a refusal to rationalize, and Daniel could have rationalized in at least 3 ways. First of all, Daniel could have easily rationalized because of his age. Now, Daniel was probably 83 or 84 at this point. He had served God faithfully in Babylon since he was probably in his mid-teens, since he was 14, nearly 70 years. And if I had been Daniel, I could easily see myself saying, it's time to retire. I have been faithful for many years, and I don't need to fight this fight. I can just retire, and if I retire, then these enemies won't pursue me any longer. Often courage is simply refusing to quit. And Daniel, at this point, refused to quit. And then in the second place, Daniel could have rationalized that it was okay to pray in secret. He wouldn't have to abandon his habit of praying 3 times a day, but there was no need to continue to do it with the windows open toward Jerusalem so anyone could hear. No need to advertise this disobedience to the new law. No sense in helping his enemies put him in the lion's den. And by the way, we will find this kind of rationalizing increasingly easy as Christians in a post-Christian culture. People don't really care if we're Christians as long as we keep it completely private. Don't bring it into the public square. I don't want to hear about your Christianity. But Daniel very deliberately refused to rationalize in this way. I believe that Daniel reasoned something like this. I have served